Two things define you: your patience when you have nothing, and your attitude when you have everything.
Choices available to us that it can all be a little bit overwhelming at times. But my guest this morning says that it's our ability to control our choices these days that's actually a gift. When Norman Swan was growing up in Glasgow, the city with the highest rate of heart disease in the world, it was the lack of choices his family and fellow Glaswegians had that led him to a life in medicine and then journalism. Now he's arguably the most trusted doctor in the country, and he's written a book to help us all navigate the complex terrain of our health. Dr. Norman Swan, welcome to Life Matters.
Thanks, Tam.
On a daily basis in your work, Norman, you're surveying the health landscape that we inhabit. What did the world you grew up in look like compared to now?
Well, a dominant image I've got is my grandfather had 11 brothers and sisters. We had a very large family in Glasgow. And I remember being dragged as a child to afternoon teas with great aunties around the place. And you could hardly see in the room for the smoke. Literally, you could cut the smoke with a knife. Every woman in the room smoked. There was a lot of loud conversation. I couldn't work out as a child what people, they saw each other on a regular basis and they still found something to talk about, but certainly was the smoke. I remember going to the shops with my mother in the car, and she smoked at that point, and feeling utterly ill at the end of the day because she was smoking inside the car. Things that are just unbelievable now.
Yeah.
My mother had a chip pan on I call it the cooker. I've never actually got round to calling it a stove, even though I spent most of my life in Australia.
Norman, really?
Yeah, on the cooker, there was a chip pan, meaning oil, a pot covered in this. It's all revolting to talk about it. And we would have had chips once a day at least.
Wow, I can feel my arteries hardening just you talking about that.
Yeah, I've got chest pain and it's going up into my jaw as I speak. And this was normal. Occasionally we'd have a salad, but it was an incredibly unhealthy, and nobody took exercise. Gyms were sort of dark places down side alleys where men would go to buff up, but not. It wasn't a middle class thing. It was very much a working class thing. Were gyms. It was extraordinary.
It is, and obviously we've come a very long way since those days.
Well, we have in Australia. Glasgow still has a very high rate of coronary heart disease.
Yes, deep fried Mars bars, anybody?
Well, but that's, you see, now this is one of the book is full of, it's called So You Think You Know What's Good For You. And the book is full of paradoxes. So people think that Glaswegians have this appalling rate of coronary heart disease and other problems as well because of deep fried Mars bars and so on. But the reality, and this is one of the recurrent messages in the book, is that, H.L. Mencken said, for every complicated problem is a simple solution, which is always wrong, is that it's not as simple as that. There are plenty of other cities with similar levels of poverty, of smoking, of unhealthy lifestyle and so on, but they don't quite have the Glaswegian levels of heart disease and other problems. And it's more than genetics, similar genetic populations. And the problem kind of started in the late 50s, early 60s. And what happened then was there were suburbs, and anybody that listening who comes from Scotland will know what I'm talking about, is that there was a very poor area in Glasgow just south of the river called the Gorbals. Mm-hmm. And that's where a lot of migrants came, but it's also an area of intense poverty. And when you see photographs of it, it looks terrible. People lived in tenements, kids played in the water at the back, and we shared bathroom between 3 or 4 apartments, and people living in crowded circumstances. So it wasn't good. And out of the best intentions, they decided they were going to knock down the Gorbals and then distribute people to housing schemes in the periphery, not necessarily, just a little way out. They had names like Castle Milk and Easterhouse and places like that. Mm-hmm. That's when the problem dates from, because what the Gorbals had was a community. And what they did inadvertently was actually destroy the community and take people to distant places where they had no community, no social support, very little things to do, rather than the Gorbals, which was actually CBD. And that destruction of community made an enormous difference. And you think, well, what's going on here? And it comes back to what you were talking about in your lead, which is control. Is that you took away agency from people by putting them in a hopeless circumstance. And that has huge effects on your mind, on your brain and your body. And one of the core things I talk about, which kind of sets the frame for everything else, is that people think the mind and the body are separate. They're not separate. They're one and the same.
You're very clear on them being one.
That's right. And therefore, why would you be surprised if you take away the social shocks out of people's lives and they get sick, because what happens in the brain affects the body and what happens in the body affects the brain.
Norman, there's also a lot of emphasis in your book on choices and how to help people make them. But how much do socioeconomic factors affect things? Do we all actually have choices available to us, or just people who can afford it?
Well, two things about choices. One is the style of the book, is that I hate most health books. You know, they wag their finger at you, they tell you what you should be doing, they give you simple solutions for complicated problems, and they kind of tell you what to do. And what I'm aiming to do in this one is to give you choices that here's the menu, if you like. It's up to you. Even when I'm talking about a drug like ice, not being judgmental about it is, here are the facts. You can make the decisions based on the facts, and you can trust these facts, but make your own decision. It depends what you want in life. And, most people who go to a gym don't go to extend their life. They go to sculpt their body, which is fine as long as you know that's what you're doing. Anyway, but you're right. Socioeconomic factors, how much money you have, what education level you've got, what your housing is like, how much social support you've got, how many people you can call upon when in a time of trouble, have an enormous impact on this. And when you, for example, when they've done studies in workplaces, so Sir Michael Marmot in London, who's an expatriate Australian working in London, now world famous for his work in just this area, has shown that people in the middle in workplaces who are, they're not running the place, they're in the middle, who are under pressure, can't make decisions about how they do their work, are micromanaged, that is incredibly toxic chronic stress. And it's the same stress that a single parent with 3 kids on a pension experiences, that they've got no latitude in their life. And that causes this, it's not acute stress, it's chronic stress.
Right.
And their children experience it too. And it's erosive both on development and on how your body works.
So it's impossible to understand that concept of chronic stress unless you accept then that the mind and body are one.
Yes, that is absolutely right. And people resist this. They say, well, doctors are terrified about saying to people, look, I think you're a bit depressed, and that's, there's 2 things going on here, and what happens in your brain is affecting your body. People say, oh, he's telling me that she's telling me that I'm nuts, and it's that it's all in my head, which is not what's happening. They're much more relaxed about this concept in Europe, which is that the mind and the body are one. And what you eat affects your brain, and what goes on in your brain affects the rest of your body.
I really like that in your book, Norman, you're very straight talking and you don't pull any punches. You describe yourself as a doer Scot who's sensitive to bullshit and doesn't care much if you pierce a few bubbles as long as there's good evidence to support your sometimes jaundiced views. You get a bit cranky at times, which I quite like. Fair to say you're not a huge fan of the term wellness. Tell us why that is.
Well, it drives me nuts. The other one is resilience. We'll come to that, no doubt.
Okay, I'll write that down. We'll come back.
Life Matters is, I used to present Life Matters, so I know resilience is a core concept for Life Matters. We'll burst our Life Matters bubble in a minute. But anyway, wellness, look, the whole wellness thing, it drives me completely bonkers. So it's this notion that there is somebody in the world who jumps out of bed in the morning, full of beans, feeling great, everything's fantastic. I've got the most beautiful children in the world. I go and wash my teeth, my perfectly formed white teeth in the mirror, admire either my flat abdomen or my thin thighs, and and then I go on with the day, and the day just unfolds.
Are you saying that's not
magic.
normal?
Well, you and I experience that, but does anybody else? But that's this wellness thing, that there's something called wellness, when in fact most of us get out of bed feeling crap. And, if you think hard about it, you're a bit sore from your yesterday's exercise. And you look at yourself in the mirror and you think, there'll never be a six-pack there. I'm never going to get beyond this Pinot Noir abdomen I've got. And you just, you're not feeling great, but, you eventually feel okay. And the fact of the matter is, how would you know you're feeling well and feeling great if a lot of the time you're not feeling great? It's just the world is, you're dealing with and so on. You need this cycle of life and this notion that there's some high point that you should be reaching all the time if you only eat this green or red gunk.
My guest is Dr. Norman Swan, physician and journalist, and the author of a new book called So You Think You Know What's Good For You. We're talking about Norman's aversion to the term wellness. So instead of wellness, Norman, you offer up a different approach, that of good enough. Why should we be striving for good enough?
Simply because it's practical.
and achievable.
Yeah, I mean, there was a actually I can't remember whether it was Bruno Bettelheim or I can't remember. There was another child psychologist whose name escapes me, and it was a book called The Good Enough Parent. I think it was Bettelheim, and it was called The Good Enough Parent. That we all strive to be fantastic parents, when actually most of us are just good enough. We set limits on our kids. We love them, but we're not perfect all the time. And it's the same here. It's good enough to be good enough. And the reason for this is that first of all, you can't excel in every part of life and exercise and everything else. But as I say again and again in the book, when you look at people who are healthy and live a long time, it's a package of stuff. And you just got to be good enough at that package of stuff. Not all of us can have a backyard where we're growing fresh vegetables and herbs. Not all of us can cook every meal perfectly. But if you do it often enough and you value friendship and the people and family and people around you, just do it well enough. You don't have to be excellent at everything.
Now, Norman, another term that seems to give you the irrits is work-life balance. Where's the problem with that idea, and why doesn't it work?
Well, it's first of all, it's poorly defined, and what is it? It assumes that work isn't part of life, and it assumes that work has some sort of misery attached to it. And I think it's felt more acutely, just because of the unfairness of how we split household tasks. It's felt more acutely by women who are trying to juggle family, households, the multitasking that goes on, which is why actually I've got a section in the book which is what is it about turning 40? Because I keep on coming across 40-year-old women who are leaving their relationships, who are unhappy and looking for something new. And work-life balance is part of that, and getting a balance in your life. So it's not that it doesn't exist, it's just that what is that balance? And it suggests that you can separate the two. And really it's about being happy and content and in control of your life. And if you're not, then that's the issue, rather than I've got to have time in my life for myself and my recreation and what have you. I just think it's a hard, that if that's your goal, it's kind of a misplaced goal. Again, it comes back to that thing is, what is your goal in life? Well, if my goal in life is to do well at work and earn a lot of money, then that's your goal in life. And then there'll be sacrifices you might have to make on the life side of it. If your goal in life is, I hate being at work because I want to be with my kids all the time, then that's your goal. But is just focusing just on the balance thing is not necessarily going to make the equation right for you.
You're right that many people feel like they don't have the time to devote to making the choices that they need to make. So how would you suggest people prioritise carving out some time for their health and well-being?
Tam, the first thing I learnt when I was a medical student was do as I say, but not as I do. Okay, so let's just put this one on the table. if you're wanting this book for a recipe for life, buy another book. This gives you the menu. The problem is, as exactly as you said at the beginning of our conversation, is that some people don't have the luxury of that choice. Let me give you an example of how it actually can come together quite well for you without actually having to do very much. And it's in a section I call Forget the French, the Paradox is Greek. Mm-hmm. So the second longest lived people in the world, and this is research done at Deakin University in Melbourne by Tanya Thodis, a great research group in nutrition, is that Greek Australians, particularly those living in Melbourne and early first generation Greek Australians, live a long time. And as soon as you say that, you say, oh, it's the Mediterranean diet. Well, it's true to an extent that they eat a Mediterranean diet, a Cretan-style diet. And if you go to Coburg, you'll find people with a slow-cooking oven in their garage. That's true that you will see that. But that misses the point when you look at Greek Australians, particularly those who live in Melbourne. And this work was actually pioneered by a researcher at Monash called John Powles, who went on to Cambridge and unfortunately died a few years ago. And he studied people who came to Melbourne from the island of Lefkada. And he compared the people in Melbourne from Lefkada to their brothers and sisters and first-degree relatives back in Lefkada. And he noticed years and years ago that they did better in Australia, even though they adopted some aspects of the poor Australian lifestyle, like eating a lot of meat and so on. But later in life, they have returned to more of a Mediterranean lifestyle. But that's not all. They have either an allotment or a backyard, and they grow their vegetables, their own vegetables or their own herbs, even if they don't have a very big backyard. And that's used fresh in cooking. So you've got the raw food movement. What's very clear is that cuisine and how you cook is very, very important, because in that pot is a chemistry set that produces very potent antioxidants and different kind of chemicals, and I talk about a lot of this in the book, than you could find in any pharmacy.
So it's about keeping it simple with a Mediterranean diet.
And how you cook. But that's not all. So they're getting a bit of exercise in the yard. They're often having frequent family dinners. And they probably never left religion, but they've certainly returned to the Greek Orthodox Church later in life.
So there's that sense of community as well.
Yeah. And then on top of that, if you are into Greek Orthodoxy, there's about 100 fast days a year.
Ah, interesting.
Now, these are not Michael Mosley fasts. Sorry, Michael. These are best described as vegan fasts. So they, and again, talk about it in the book, is that they, for 100 days a year, and presumably not everybody ascribes to that, they don't eat meat, fish or anything, or dairy, and they just have they have plant foods for a day.
Right. So interesting talking about the diet. You also talk about other simple elements of life and the importance of prioritising the 4 Fs: fun, fitness, family, friends, as well as making pleasure a priority and prioritising sex. That doesn't sound very medical. Does that actually make a difference to our health?
Well, they say, there is research to suggest that the frequency of sex is related to how your rate of heart disease and so on. Now, it could be cause and effect. That if you've got heart disease, you're not necessarily fitter for sex and so on. But no, this is not a medical book. I don't think there's anything particularly medical in the whole book. I don't talk about sickness at all. I've never read a medical
book with quite so much swearing in it, just quietly.
Well, just, I'm just
keeping it real, myself.
I come from Glasgow, and
fair enough.
We are world champion swearers. You just don't hear much when I'm on.
Sorry,
air.
I interrupted.
No, it's fine. And anyway, so sex is good for you. I mean, an interesting anecdote about writing the sex section of the book. A lot of the book there's an aspect of memoir to the book. I write about personal experiences as they relate to, particularly about control and so on. And quite an amusing episode when I was about 4 years. Well, it wasn't amusing at the time when I was 4 years old in a fun park in Glasgow. But anyway, so it's very anecdotal, and I tell anecdotes throughout it, except in the sex section. I stayed away from anecdotes in that.
I noticed that. It was quite brief.
Yeah, well, no, it's quite a long section, but I wrote it. My advice from people who written a lot of books is, just get it down. So when I wrote the sex section, and then I wrote down, I thought, this is just written by a heterosexual white man. Mm-hmm. And then I did research that I should have done before I started. And I've been reporting on gay politics, on HIV and other things for many, many years. And I thought I knew this stuff. But my eyes were opened to the whole LGBTIQ experience. And I've tried to integrate that into it because the experience of sex and sexual identity has changed. And some of this book was driven by conversations I've had over many years with millennials and the questions that they've got. And sex is a source of anxiety. And so that my sex section is called Sexiety and my sleep section is called Sleepiety because we have this unnecessary level of anxiety. And so, sexual identity, sex is important, not for everybody, but for a lot of people it is. And I try and make sense of that, perhaps for myself as much as the audience.
Norman, thank you so much for your book. It is a cracking read, very enjoyable, and lovely to speak to you this morning.
You're very kind, Tam. Thanks very much.
Dr. Norman Swan, RN broadcaster, co-host of Coronacast and author of the new book, So You Think You Know What's Good For You, the ultimate health guide from Australia's most trusted doctors.